Hetty Green ate cold oatmeal for breakfast every morning of her adult life. Not because she couldn't afford a stove, but because heating it cost money she had already decided not to spend. By the time she died in 1916, she controlled a fortune estimated at somewhere between $100 and $200 million, a sum that made her, by a wide margin, the wealthiest woman in America, perhaps the wealthiest in the world. She wore the same black dress until it disintegrated into threads. She refused to pay for heat in her own apartment through New York winters. And when her son Ned injured his leg as a boy, she spent so long searching for a free clinic to avoid paying for treatment that the injury worsened past the point of saving, and the leg was eventually amputated. She had more money than she could have spent in 40 lifetimes, and her body never once stopped behaving as though the next famine was already on its way up the stairs. Hetty Green was not insane, and she was not simply cheap. She was running a survival program that had outlived the conditions it was built for, the same program, in a milder, more disguised form, still running underneath nearly every modern argument about overspending, debt, status, and the strange, persistent feeling that no number is ever quite enough. For the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, resource availability was not a number on a screen. It was unpredictable, seasonal, and frequently catastrophic. A band that encountered abundance, a successful hunt, a fruiting season, an unusually generous harvest, faced a choice with no modern equivalent: consume now, or attempt to preserve a portion against a future that nobody could forecast with any reliability. The humans who survived long enough to reproduce were disproportionately the ones whose nervous systems leaned hard toward the second option, treating any windfall as a temporary anomaly rather than a stable new baseline, and treating the impulse to keep accumulating as something closer to biological alarm than a personal preference. This wasn't greed in any moral sense. It was the same caching instinct visible in squirrels burying far more acorns than any single winter requires, a hedge against an unknown future written directly into behavior, because the animals that hedged survived disproportionately more often than the animals that assumed today's abundance would simply continue. The economists Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir spent years documenting exactly how this hedge against scarcity wiring behaves under modern conditions. And their research, published in a body of work examining cognitive function under resource pressure, produced a finding that should unsettle anyone who has ever judged a person's financial decisions as a simple failure of discipline. Studying sugarcane farmers in rural India, workers who receive the bulk of their annual income in a single lump sum after harvest, then experience genuine scarcity in the months leading up to the next one. They administered identical cognitive tests to the same farmers at 2 points in the cycle, once while flush with post-harvest cash, once while genuinely strapped before the next payment arrived. The difference in performance was equivalent to roughly 13 IQ points, comparable to the cognitive impairment caused by a full night of lost sleep. Scarcity wasn't simply uncomfortable. It was consuming so much mental bandwidth, automatically and below conscious awareness, that everything else, judgment, planning, patience, operated with measurably less processing power left over to use. This is the invisible architecture sitting underneath nearly every modern money problem that gets diagnosed, lazily, as a failure of willpower. The scarcity tracking system evolved to manage caloric and material resources under conditions of genuine, survival-relevant unpredictability. It was never built to distinguish between an actual famine and a checking account sitting $40 below the threshold that triggers the same neurological alarm. The body does not check the calendar before deciding it's threatened. A bank notification at 11 at night. Screen light cutting through a dark bedroom. Account balance sitting lower than expected. The chest tightens. Breath shortens. Sleep becomes harder to find. And none of it is an overreaction by the standard the system was designed under. It is the correct response to genuine resource scarcity, fired by a brain that has no internal mechanism for recognizing that this particular scarcity is a temporary, fully recoverable gap rather than the leading edge of a famine. Ulrich Malmendier and Stefan Nagel formalized a related piece of this machinery in a 2011 study published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, examining what they termed the experience effect on financial risk-taking. Tracking decades of survey data, they found that individuals who came of age during periods of severe macroeconomic hardship, high inflation, deep recession, market collapse, continued making measurably more conservative financial decisions for decades afterward, even once their personal circumstances had improved dramatically, even controlling for income, education, and current risk exposure. The imprint left by early economic scarcity didn't fade once the scarcity ended. It calcified into a durable setting, quietly steering investment choices made 30 and 40 years later by people who, on paper, had every reason to behave differently. Hetty Green's own formative years included the death of her mother, a difficult relationship with a wealthy but emotionally withholding father, and an upbringing steeped in stories of financial ruin among the merchant families surrounding her in Quaker New Bedford. The imprint set early. It never reset. Not once. Across 7 decades and $200 million. Pause here is where the mechanism splits into a second, more socially dangerous branch, because resource scarcity was never the only survival currency our ancestors were tracking. Status was a survival resource too, every bit as concrete as calories, because social rank determined access to mates, alliances, protection, and priority in moments of genuine crisis. A low-ranking member of a band faced materially worse odds than a high-ranking one, independent of any single resource shortage. Robert Sapolsky's decades of field research on wild baboon troops in Kenya demonstrated, through direct measurement of stress hormones across hundreds of individual animals, that cortisol levels track social rank instability with striking precision. Animals experiencing unstable or declining status show chronically elevated stress hormone levels comparable to, and in some measures exceeding, animals facing genuine resource shortage. The body, in other words, does not meaningfully distinguish between "I might not eat" and "I am losing status relative to my rivals." Both register as the same category of threat, processed by the same ancient circuitry, demanding the same urgent corrective action. This is the mechanism Thorstein Veblen named, without the neuroscience to back it, in his 1899 work on conspicuous consumption, the observation that a significant share of human spending exists not to satisfy material need, but to signal relative position, to broadcast rank to a social audience whose good opinion once translated directly into survival advantage. Veblen was describing leisure-class New York at the turn of the century, but the mechanism he identified is older than money itself, older than agriculture, written into a status monitoring system that evolved across 1,000,000 years in bands of perhaps 50 people, where everyone's rank was visible to everyone else at all times, settled through direct observation rather than purchase. That system was never built for an environment of credit limits and abstracted comparison. Picture the specific moment it misfires. A woman standing at a checkout counter, a new handbag in a glossy box on the belt in front of her, the card reader's small chime confirming a purchase, that will arrive on a statement in 3 weeks she has not yet allowed herself to think about. The rank monitoring circuitry that fires in that moment is identical, neurochemically, to the circuitry that once told hunter-gatherer woman she needed to secure visible status within her band before winter made alliances a matter of survival. The bag is not really about the bag. It's about a status signal aimed at an audience that, in any ancestral sense, would have determined whether she ate during a hard season, except the audience now is a feed of strangers and acquaintances whose actual material stake in her survival is zero, and whose approval, even fully secured, transfers no real resources back to her at all. The circuitry fires anyway. It cannot tell the difference between a survival-relevant audience and a decorative one. This is where conventional financial advice collapses most completely, and it collapses at the exact place most personal finance content refuses to look. The standard prescription treats overspending as a math error correctable through budgeting apps and willpower affirmations. Track the spending. See the pattern. Choose differently next time. This assumes the failure point is informational, the same mistaken assumption that plagues most advice about market behavior. The actual failure point is a status monitoring and scarcity tracking system that fires below the level where budgeting spreadsheets operate, faster than conscious deliberation, with the full neurochemical urgency of genuine threat. Telling a person whose ancient rank circuitry has been triggered by a status-coded purchase to just think it through is roughly as effective as telling a baboon with falling cortisol levels to simply reason its way out of a dominance hierarchy. The system was never designed to be reasoned with in real time. It was designed to act first and let reasoning catch up afterward, if it bothers to catch up at all. There is a second inversion buried here. The one Hetty Green's life demonstrates with almost unbearable clarity. We tend to assume the scarcity-driven hoarder and the status-driven overspender are opposite failure modes, one too tight with money, one too loose. They are the same mechanism, expressed through different available channels. Green had no social audience whose approval depended on visible consumption. The merchant world she operated in respected ruthless accumulation, not display. So her ancient threat response system found its outlet in compulsive saving rather than compulsive status spending. A modern equivalent operating inside a status-saturated environment would express the identical underlying alarm through visible acquisition instead. Different costume, same engine. Neither person is malfunctioning. Both are running an inherited program with perfect fidelity, in an environment the program was never built to interpret correctly. The leverage available here is not spend less or save more, because both instructions assume the bottleneck is decision quality rather than system design, the same category error every motivational financial framework makes. The actual leverage is building a structure that doesn't require real-time negotiation with 100,000-year-old alarm system at the exact moment it's firing. This means defining enough in advance, in writing, against fixed and specific criteria established before any windfall or shortfall arrives, a concrete number for emergency reserve, a concrete ceiling for status-adjacent spending, precisely because a definition made calmly in advance survives contact with the scarcity system in a way that a definition negotiated in the moment never will. It means recognizing that an account balance dipping below a threshold is not, in any modern context, equivalent to a famine, and building automatic, pre-committed responses, automated transfers, locked savings vehicles, waiting periods on large purchases that remove the decision from the exact moment the ancient circuitry has seized the floor. There is a colder piece of leverage sitting inside the status mechanism specifically. recognizing that a purchase is being driven by rank signaling, rather than genuine need, requires asking a single, narrow, deliberately unnatural question in the moment of wanting something. Who is the audience this is actually for? And do they have any real bearing on my material survival? The honest answer, almost always, severs the purchase from its ancient justification instantly. Because the rank monitoring system was calibrated for an audience of 50 people whose opinion of you was a genuine resource. It was never calibrated for an audience that cannot see you, doesn't know you, and would not feed you regardless of what you bought. Hetty Green's son eventually inherited a substantial fortune and, by most accounts, used it rather differently than his mother had, funding hospitals and civic projects, spending in ways his mother's circuitry would have registered as reckless. He had lived inside the same household, under the same financial discipline, and had still, somehow, arrived at a different relationship with the number itself. The imprint that calcified in Hetty never calcified the same way in him, which suggests the program, however ancient, is not a life sentence, only a default, waiting for someone to notice it's running and build something deliberate on top of it before it builds the rest of the decision on its own. She died alone in her son's New York apartment, the wealthiest woman of her era, having spent 70 years preparing for a famine that her own fortune had made structurally impossible. The oatmeal was always cold. The money never warmed it.